Valley of the Moon. I want you to know that you can use them as sources for your research paper. They're both going to be giving a brief presentation in the beginning, and then at the end we'll open it up so you guys can ask them direct questions focused on questions you have about Jack London, about the Valley of the Moon, and about your research project. Don't miss this opportunity to learn from these amazing scholars. They have wonderful backgrounds in Jack London studies, and you can learn a lot from them today. So, without further ado, who would like to begin? You want to start?
Sure. Hi. Glad to be here. I haven't been in a classroom for a long time. So, I wanted to write on. So I'm working at the Huntington Library where Jack's stuff is. And yesterday I looked at the first page of the manuscript, the original manuscript. And it surprised me to see the change in the first sentence. First he wrote, that's the first sentence that he wrote, right? So, and then it changes to, you hear me, right? So the difference that I see there is the idea of the summons. That Saxon is being called. That's what he wanted to stress. First he wanted to duplicate or imitate proletariat speech. You know, just common, everyday American speech. Now, come on, let's go to the bricklayers' picnic. You know, let's meet some guys, right? Now it becomes, you hear me. It's almost like the title of his most famous book, Call of the Wild. There's something calling Saxon. And at first it's just her friend Mary. Let's go pick up some boys, right? But then as you read through the novel, it becomes something much more. Right? She's being called by something else, right? So it's interesting to think about what that is, which I think has something to do with the title of the book, Valley of the Moon, obviously, right? The Valley of the Moon is calling her. But what that exactly means is worth describing for hours. Why is she being called? There's something about alienation of labor to the why of that. The collapse of the American city. And then that would take us to what happens to people when they're alienated from their own labor. And so that you kind of get into the scene of Saxon having a complete nervous and mental breakdown while Billy's in prison. And then what exactly is it that they find? Right? So that's kind of a brief outline of what I want to talk about. So, the title, Valley of the Moon. You can emphasize the first word, valley, or you could emphasize the second word, moon, right? So let's emphasize the second word, moon, first. So, now I'm from Chicago, so Valley of the Moon means absolutely nothing to me, right? And I came to California for the first time in the early 80s. I didn't even know what a redwood tree looked like, you know. I was shocked to learn that it was just like a pine tree or something. But, it's like kind of redwoods, you know. But, so when you read, if you just kind of eliminate everything you know about the words Valley of the Moon is wrong, and just take it as like, you know, empty symbols, what could it possibly mean? Well, actually that happens in the book, right? When they're in Carmel and their friend, is it Mark Hall, I think, who takes her and says, I want to show you something, and takes the telescope and shows her the moon. There's your Valley of the Moon. So it's actually a very literal understanding of the word moon, right? It's not metaphoric, because back in our minds we know that it's a translation, or supposedly a translation of the word Sonoma, right? So it has metaphoric content. But the first time that we learn what moon means in that phrase is it's literal. It's going to be a valley in the moon, right? So, that makes us think, well, what is a valley, what would a valley in the moon actually be like? Well, okay, so here's the leap of faith. It's like the Arctic. It's cold, it's lonely, and it's isolated, right? And so when, imagine you're a reader picking up the first copy of Valley of the Moon and the year that it was published, which was 1912, right? He wrote it in the spring, late spring, summer of 1911. You pick it up for the first time and you think, what kind of book am I going to be reading? Well, the word moon, if you take it literally, it sounds like science fiction. And you think, okay, I'm going to be reading a book about science fiction, a science fiction novel. And you wouldn't be too far off the mark, right? Because science fiction at that time was relatively new, but it was still happening, right? And at around this same time, Jack is collecting material for a science fiction novel called The Farthest Distant, which is supposed to be about interstellar travel. So, and Mars, going to Mars, going to the moon, whatever, right? So you wouldn't be too far off if you thought it was science fiction. But if you were making that metaphoric connection, like distant, lonely, cold, you know, you might think it's another Klondike novel, right? So, if you've read Odyssey of the North, and you would know that in the Odyssey of the North, there's a quest, just like in Valley of the Moon, and these guys, this party of people who want to get fabulously wealthy and find, you know, their dream spot, go off and they find it, they think, and it's an abyss. It's not quite a pit, it's a little deeper than a valley, but it's kind of like a valley. And at the bottom of this valley abyss is a cabin with a table, and on the table are gold nuggets and writing. And so in London, for my theory, is that this is where Jack London's imagination lives. Not on the top of Mount Parnassus, like Greek mythology or something like that. No, it's much more hellish. It's great because it gives them the words to produce books that make them money, but in order to get to that place, you have to go through hell. And once you get there, if you go with somebody else, you're going to end up killing each other over the goal, and you're going to end up with nothing. So this place where the imagination lived is really kind of a scary, awful, wonderful, sublime place, right? And this is what's inside Jack. And I think this is what his principal preoccupation as a writer is. Jack comes from the ghetto, right, like Saxon and Billy. So he doesn't have a college education. He doesn't know the first thing about writing as a career. He doesn't know anything about sophisticated American culture. So the imagination for him, it could be anything. But for him, it's this thing that's inside of him that he can't get rid of him. It's telling him, write this, right? It's summoning him. It's calling him to go write these books. And so he's perfectly happy to do it. But the question in his mind always is, why, right? So if you make this connection between the valley in the moon and the abyss in the Arctic, then you realize that what this quest is a search for the source of the imagination. And that's what Saxon and Billy are looking for. So as you're reading through the novel, you think that maybe Saxon and Billy are author figures, that they're writers too, like Jack. They're not, right? But when they finally get to the valley, just to jump ahead a little bit, when they finally get to the Valley of the Moon, who do they find? They find a writer who apparently thinks that the Valley of the Moon is the best place to live in order to write, right? Okay, so they go on this quest. And why do they go on the quest? Because they're fucked up, right? And why? Well, because living in the city is that's what it does to you, right? And why does living in the city do this to you? Because of the job situation, right? You become a work beast. You become a ghetto person, which is how they're described, right? Now, if you've read People of the Abyss by Jack London from 1902, which is all about people of the abyss, right? Which is all about the poor people in London who are struggling to make ends meet, and those people, Jack imagines as ghetto people, right? Then you see that there's a connection between Saxon and Billy and those people in London, all right? I'm just kind of sketching this out briefly, but the connections are there, right? So the city is an abyss of sorts as well, right? So what happens? Billy drinks a lot and goes to prison, and Saxon has this complete nervous breakdown. So something's wrong with the insides of their heads, basically. Right? So this quest is basically about finding a cure, in my opinion, finding a cure for what's wrong in their heads. Previous to Valley of the Moon, London wrote a novel called Martin Eden, which is about an author figure who commits suicide. And towards the end, he's like, what's wrong with me? And a friend of his says, there's something wrong with your think box. Right? So London's concern is basically about what's wrong with inside of my head, right? And how to fix it. So this is where, and how do you find out what's wrong? There's something wrong, what is it, right? And so if you look at these various moments with Saxon and different kind of media, you realize that she's using media to find out what's wrong. So the simplest media is a mirror. And she stares at herself. You can like track the different moments in the novel where she's like staring at herself in a mirror. She's like looking at her face, and is this the face that Billy could love? What she's really trying to struggle out is, who is she? You know, who am I? What's inside of me, right? And she looks at that photograph of Charlie Wong, and she throws it across the room. I mean, and it's violent, right? She looks at the face and she sees it's a mean, ugly face. She's like, gets rid of it, right? So these media are incredibly powerful indicators of what's inside of you, right? But the mirror doesn't tell her enough, and the photographs don't tell her enough. They tell her something, they don't tell her quite enough, right? And then there's that moment where they, at the end of book one, where they go off on their journey. Right? And what prompts them to go on that journey? They go to the movies, right? So there's something missing from a photograph and from the mirror, and it's movement and sound and color, right? It's not fully representational. A movie is closer to a fuller representation of life outside and life inside, right? So they look at the movie and they're like, aha, that's where we want to go. That's telling me what is inside of me that wants to get out and make itself known. And that will cure me of my mental illness, basically, is what she has. She has a mental illness, right? So they go off onto the walk. All along throughout the novel, too, are dreams. And Saxon dreams a fair amount. Not as much as some characters in London's work, but she's dreaming a lot. Now, dreams are the language of the subconscious, right? This is something that London read in psychoanalytical literature from 1911 to 1960. The dreams are the language of the subconscious, and that an artist, when he dreams, discovers basically the imagination within. Does Billy dream? Does Billy look at photographs? Does Billy, he goes to the movies, right? And it's very interesting to contrast Billy and Saxon's reaction to that movie. Billy's like laughing. Oh, look at that. Oh, and then the chicken comes in. You know, he's like very literal, you know. But Saxon sees it for what it is. It's both a representation of the outside and a representation of what she wants, which is inside of her, right? It's a representation of her, the workings of her subconscious. Aha, this is what I really want, because this is what will fix me of the alienation that I feel from my labor from working in the city that's destroying me. The thing that, the part of the body that connects, I don't know if Iris, Professor Dunkle, Iris has talked about this, but what part of the body is connected to Billy and what part of the body is connected to Saxon? The eyes are connected to Saxon. She's far-seeing, she's clear-sighted. It's almost Greek in the way that he says these things, you know, these portmanteau phrases that he attaches. And Billy, what part of the body, I mean, besides, he's a coxman, basically, right? He's a big leg. But it's his hands, right, that are the real focus, you know, of his body. You know, he works with his hands. He's very literal. So there's Saxon. So sight, and of course, is connected to the imagination in a huge way, right? So inner vision is synonymous with the imagination. So they get to the Valley of the Moon. This is where they're going to live. And that final scene, which is almost, I mean, it's great in a way, you know, it'd be interesting to hear your responses to how you feel about that, you know. The two deer come down, they're going to put the baby, and it's like, it's treacly and romantic and sentimental and everything like that, right? But just before they see that deer and fawn come down, London uses the phrase, the spirit of the place. And that should really set off alarm bells for you. I mean, that phrase is loaded, right, in London. The first instance of it, I think, is in his short story, All Gold Canyon. And there's this crazy old miner, and he's looking for gold in the Sierras, and all of a sudden, a deer breaks through the woods. And he says, aha, it's the spirit of the place. And the same thing happens at the end of Valley of the Moon, right? All right, so you have spirit, she's found the spirit, right? Which is both outside and inside again. It should also trigger off an alarm bell because what happened, what's the debate, and this is, I'll close and shut up, but what's the debate at the very beginning of the novel between Mary and Saxon, which is just so amazing? It's about God. Who writes a sentimental, romantic novel that begins with a debate about who God is? Who does that? I mean, London read every trashy novel there was at this point, right? I mean, Marie Corelli, Eleanor Glynn, every bestseller, bodice ripper that you would find on a magazine rack today in a grocery store, Jack read it, right? He knew that stuff backwards and forwards. And did he try to, because it sold. It sold like crazy. It was women's fiction for women, written by women for women, right? And Jack, you would think, okay, I'm going to do that too. And does he do it? It's like, well, let's philosophize. Let's talk about who God is. Yeah, okay. I see God as a Mexican who makes puzzles. What the fuck? Who says things like that? You know? And Mary's like, no, he's not a little dirty greaser. No, he's like a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you know, with combed hair, you know, and flowing beard, and, you know, the typical bullshit representation, right? And Mary and Saxon's like, well, I don't think so, you know. And that's just crazy, right? And how does that debate end? Well, we don't know what a spirit looks like. And so you move, so it seems like, I mean, the question is, how do I find out to fix my mental disease, right? That seems to be one big question at the beginning that goes to the end. But the other big question is, what does a spirit look like? You know? Is it a Mexican who's making puzzles, some old guy? Or is it you know, white Anglo-Saxon father figure, you know, traditional white father figure? Or is it a deer? I'll leave that to you.
Wow. Well, those are great connections you're making. And what I wanted to do was really talk about Charmian's contribution to this novel. And I thought, first of all, I would read you, you have the inscription that London wrote. You know, when he would, every time he published a book, he would write inscriptions to, he would give copies to Charmian, to his mother, to his first wife, you know, to his good friends, his close friends. And so for the Valley of the Moon, he says, "My dear woman, this is our, quote, book of love. Here in our Valley of the Moon, where we have lived and known our love ever since that day you rode with me to the divide of the Napa Hills, and before that, Jack London." So the day they rode to the divide of the Napa Hills was basically when he decided that he would move to Glen Ellen, to Sonoma County. And he had been in this slump, they call it the long sickness, which I think was the trauma over divorcing his first wife, and because they had 2 little girls, and he hated not being with them. But Charmian was his ideal mate, and in Charmian's diaries, she talks about writing, collaborating with Jack on Valley of the Moon. And I thought, you know, when he gets into all of this stuff about the fancies and the pretties and sewing lace on the underpants and the bra and the corset covers, and I thought, you know, most men would probably be embarrassed to know all that or to put it out there. I mean, what are you going to think? And but I think he got help from Charmian, and Charmian says, "Many a novelist depends upon his mate for a woman's viewpoint on his characters. So Jack, who today asked me for some details and items on Billy and Saxon in the Valley of the Moon, I gladly comply." And then she says, a little bit later, type, "Make notes on Saxon and her sewing and taste for the novel." And then she says, "Having an interesting time," and she puts "collaborating" in quotation marks with Jack in the novel, Valley of the Moon. "It is a comfort to be able to contribute little items of horse or dog or scenery while he reigns over his handmaiden with his genius in storytelling. I seem to have missed it, though my mother was a fiction writer and a good poet. I like to paint word pictures, and if they are useful to my husband, I am actually grateful to what little talent I may possess in helping." So, you know, why would she put quotation marks around collaborating with him? You know, she must have, I think, been flattered that he asked, and she did write 3 books. But, you know, after he died, she struggled with writing and never completed a major project she had set for herself. So it seems that she kind of thrived on his encouragement and support, and probably was a little uncomfortable comparing herself as a writer to Jack because he was so good, you know. And oh yeah, he was so good. He knew months and months before he ever started writing this book exactly what he was going to do, before he even did the research for all of the small-scale farming, the people they interview on their journey. And so this is at the end of May 1911. London writes his editor, George Brett, at Macmillan. And he says, you know, I've been writing all these short stories, and, you know, I really like to write a novel. You know, to have some literary stature, you know, I have to put a novel out every once in a while. He said, but I get so much money from these short stories that if I'm going to stop writing them in order to write a novel, I want you to give me an advance. And he said, right now I'm making $3,500 a month on my stories. And I want you to give me $1,500 a month. This is the end of May. He said, starting in October and go through March. For 5 months, I want $1,500 a month. And so I looked up online. You know, you can find these conversions. And so $3,500, this was in 2010, is, do you know what it's worth now? $71,000. So it's like $71,000 a month. And now if you multiply that times 12, a yearly figure, that's $952,000. So that's almost $1 million a year. All right, and I thought, well, he must have been exaggerating. But then I thought, George Brett was like the top dog in the whole editing game, and he knew exactly what London was making, how many books we were selling, how many magazines with his stories in it. So he could not have, he might have fudged a teensy-weensy bit, but there was not much wiggle room there. So, oh, I'm sorry, he said he's making $3,000 a month, and that was the $71,000 in today's money. And so, what's interesting to me is that in May of 11, he writes to George Brett, and he says he's busy having now a beautiful dream ranch. I'm doing on this dream ranch 2 things. I'm planting eucalyptus trees by the hundreds of thousands, and also I'm building my dream house. This means that I'm compelled to pay out quite a lot of money each month. It also explains why I have had so many books of short stories on hand, while I have not one novel completed or started. It also leads up to what I am driving at. I should like to begin a certain novel that I have in mind on October 1 of this year. It will be something like 100,000 words in length. I think it is going to be a popular story. Its motive is back to the land. For once in my life, I have a story that will not be offensive to the bourgeois morality and bourgeois business ethics, while at the same time it is a story of which I shall absolutely and passionately believe every word. I take a man and a woman, young, who belong to the working class in a large city. Both are wage workers. The man is unskilled, the driver of a brewery wagon, or something of that sort. The first third of the book is to be devoted to their city environment, their meeting, their love affair, and the trials and tribulations of such a marriage in the working class. Comes hard times, the woman gets the vision, she is the guiding force. They start wandering penniless over the country of California. Of course, they have all sorts of adventures, and their wandering becomes a magnificent, heroic, detailed pilgrimage. After many hints and snatches of vision, always looking for the spot, they do find the real one and only spot and settle down to successful small-scale farming. Not only will it begin as a love story, but it will end as a love story. And the thing that will make their love live to the end will be the story I intend to write. So, you know, on June 1st, he wrote this on May 30th, 19. On June, he and Charmian took off. They hitched up 4 horses to a wagon, and they went up the coast of California, up into Oregon, and then they came back through the center of the state, back down to Glen Ellen. And that was on, you know, every place they stopped. You know, he would talk to people about farming and what are you growing and what do you get for it and what's your technique. And, you know, he was thinking he's going to move on to the ranch, and he wants to know, you know, what successful ranching techniques are at the time. But he writes this without even having done his research. So he was, you know, he knew exactly what he was going to do before he sat down to do it. It wasn't like, well, just take a paper to a pencil, a pen to a paper, and see what comes to your mind. No. He knew. And well, on the same day that he wrote this letter to his, this is how he made money as a writer. I mean, he was smart. He was smart about it. I mean, you have to have the imagination. Not everybody can write, but he also wrote the same letter to the publisher of the magazine, which is going around, Cosmopolitan, and Phillips, and he said the same thing. I'm going to be writing this novel. He describes it word for word like I read it to you, and he said, I want an advance, and I will give you, you will have the serial rights. So what he would do is he would write a novel, and then he would sell the serial rights, which would come out in a Cosmopolitan or some popular magazine that sold thousands and thousands of copies, because they had just during London's lifetime figured out the magazines that they could sell advertising. And that would pay for the paper and the publishing, and so the subscription could be cheap, could be 5 cents. So all of a sudden, they were selling hundreds of thousands of magazines, and that's why everybody could afford those, and he was in them all the time, because he got so much money. But he would, so for a novel, he would publish it first as a serial in the magazine, like once a month, and then the book would come out, and he also had an editor in England who would try and sell the rights in England. So I think he wanted, the deal with the magazine didn't go so well. I think he wanted, I have it in here somewhere, $1,500, no, he wanted, no, something, I thought it was $500 a month, and he had to do a little negotiating with the magazine, but he got an advance. And so what he used the advance for was, his 4-horse strip. And meanwhile, he was writing stuff, things were getting published on his strip. He just was, so dedicated and determined and focused that no matter where he was or what he was doing, he kept his writing project on the front burner and moved it along. So that's it for me.
You want to talk about the pictures?
Oh, the pictures are, okay, what's going around are, in the magazine, when this was serialized in the magazines would have an illustrator do illustrations. When you get the book, usually, none of the books had any illustrations, but the magazines did. And so with those, it's especially interesting because if you look at Billy and Saxon, they look no more like working class kids from the ghetto in Oakland. No, can you hold up that one right there? Yeah, either one. I mean, on the cover. It's on the cover. That's when I did Billy and Saxon. Isn't that great?
Where's the dirt?
Yeah, no. Yeah. And the only, in all of those illustrations, the only one where you see anything that resembles working class life is the strike. The strikers and the fight in her front yard. That was, down and dirty. That was working class. Yeah. But Billy and Saxon were presented to the reading public, all right, as, she looks like a Gibson girl in that cover. So how the stories were marketed and what the underlying message was are oftentimes miles apart. And of course, if that was going to sell the magazine and his story, why would he complain? But if you read it carefully, you see there's a lot more going on than these two. They look like debutantes, flirting with each other. And that's not the story at all. There's a great one where he's practicing boxing and with her. Yeah, you have to see it when they're done. That's good. Yeah. So now I guess we're open to questions you have.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Remember that you can use them as sources in your papers. And you can ask them about all different topics, not just on the Valley Limited, about Jack London. So if your research paper is on something different, you can ask them about it as well.
My topic is politics, then versus now. And And my question was, if Jack London was published in our time period, with all the racist language that he was saying in his novels, and having Obama be our president today, like, would he still be as popular as he was back then? Or would he be be published like he was back then, or no?
Well, I think that it's not clear, because a character says something racist, that Jack London is racist, okay? And what you have to think is, he's trying to present these working class young adults accurately. So they say things and they do things that are typical, that are believable, that you know, people from that class and position in life at that time would have been saying and doing.
So it's just like basically like he used to saying that. That's why he said it. Like it wasn't a big deal to him.
He would have heard people who were Teamsters, you know, acting like that and saying those things and behaving. I mean, and the women working in the laundry and the press, you know, they would get excited about going to the bricklayers party. And I mean, I think that he had an ear for the expression, and he captured it. You know, when he was in the Klondike, he had a cabin up on Stewart River, which is not anywhere near Dawson City. And in fact, people up there said this was an old moose hunting cabin, because there wasn't any gold up there. But he walked down after the river froze over. He went to Dawson City and he spent 6 weeks there. And what did he do? Do you have any idea what he did?
To the bars.
He went to the bars and he sat next to the old timers and he got them talking. And he listened to those stories. He had, I believe he had total recall. And when he came back, that's where he became famous, was writing stories about the Klondike Gold Rush and the Yukon. And people, miners, guys who had gone up into the Klondike and were there with London or knew him, there at the same time, were interviewed, and they said, they all said exactly the same thing. They said, we heard all of those stories. You know, I mean, everybody get talking, it was the same damn stories over and over and over about this woman, you know, has an invader come in and she catches them, but then they don't want to kill him with this, and, you know, on and on. They all of these familiar old stories. And they said, we never thought a thing about it until we saw what London did with them. So, that's his imagination. But I mean, he has characters from different walks of life, and his first novel has a young woman from Dawson City whose father is a big merchant, and he sends her to California or someplace to private school. She gets a fancy education. She comes back. She spouts the most racist things of any of the characters, because he went to Berkeley for a semester and he saw that's where they were teaching this manifest destiny and Anglo-Saxon superiority. They were, a lot of the private schools, the fanciest schools in the United States at that time, had started Anglo-Saxon programs where they would teach the students the language. And, you know, so he's not racist. He's observing what's going on and who's got which views and attitudes. That's how I handle the racism. His views, I think, did change over his life. But pretty much he's got the people nailed. So he would see people today who are racist and who hate Obama because he's black, you know? But not everybody does. I mean, he could, I think he would nail the key people who say that. But it wouldn't be that he believes it. It's not a direct link.
One of the lines that's very surprising to me in Valley of the Moon is that House explained his racism or his attitude towards black people is he mentions Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries, two prominent boxers, right? He doesn't say one's black and one's white. He just says, here are two champions. It just so happens one's black and one's white, right? And it's just stated as fact. So now when he covered that fight in Reno, and for the San Francisco Examiner, that fight was 1912, right? Or 1910, summer of 1910. So, and he says, you know, they're like, who are you pulling for? And he's like, well, I got to pull for the white guy because I'm white, right? So is that racist? So, you know, it's a good question. I'm not going to try to answer that. But that's Jack. You know, it's like, yeah, Jack Johnson won. Not, you know, because he cheated or because, you know, the judges wanted to give it to the black guy or anything. He won because he was the best fighter. And Jack Johnson actually was, you know, a great champion, according to Jack London, right? But he still wanted to pull for the white guy, you know, because for whatever reason. And so that comes up in the Valley of the Moon. I think you also have to look at who's saying the racist things, right? So Billy obviously is a racist. I mean, there's no question. Mary, total, you know, hardcore racist, right? I mean, part of it's explained by economic determinism. You know, it's not just a belief in the superiority of one race over another. Some of it's determined by economic insecurity. I'm losing my job to these people, therefore I hate them because they're different, right? That's part of it. Now what about Saxon? It seems to me in the novel, every time Billy says something racist, Saxon's like, well, I don't know about that, you know. Or when Mary says that about God, she's like, well, does Mary ever use a racial slur, a racial epithet? I don't think so, right? So if London is siding with his characters, then it's, at the very worst, he's split on the issue, right? But I agree with what Susan said, you know. His attitude towards Asian Americans is a little different, right? There's Mrs. Mortimer. He's like, you gotta get an Asian person to work your garden, because they're like the best, you know. I'm like, is that racist? Yeah, right. She's a nice lady. Yeah, we all know nice racists, right? That's just too weird, you know. That's not pleasant. So at the very best. So yeah, the race question and the politics question is really, really important. I also wanted to make one other point about politics. So you have Bert, who's hardcore anarchist, right? Throw bombs, kill cops, you know, hardcore. Why? Because nothing else works, you know. We just got to put our lives on the line for the right thing. And we got to take down the system with bombs and guns, right? And then you have Tom, Sarah's husband. And he's like, well, if we just vote the right people into office. Now, you know, and he's like, you know, white bread socialist, right? And London rejected both of those, right? And there's a lot of documentation on that. You look into the history of the anarchist movement, and especially Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, and Jack tolerated them, liked them as people, but disagreed with their politics. So who represents Jack's political position in Valley of the Moon? Nobody. He stacks the deck, right, against basically his own position. Because his position doesn't get represented. Revolutionary socialism, whatever the hell that is. So that'd be it.
Oh, mine's about socialism. And was the fact that he was a socialist, did it help his success or did it hurt his success?
His success
as a writer.
Well, there's there's a couple of paths down that road. Okay. So you heard the letter that Susan read, right? So this is a book that will not offend bourgeois mentality, right? And yet, there's one reading, a very powerful reading about the ending of the book. It's like, Billy, all along, they're like, when we find jobs, we're not going to work ourselves to death like these bourgeois capitalists, right? I mean, work's important, you got to make a living, but we want to have fun. And what happens at the end? All he does is work. He turns into a bourgeois capitalist, right? And that's a bad thing. So how does it not end up offending bourgeois capitalist sentimentality, you know? It's like, so he wants to write a popular novel, and he wants to be a success, but his socialism and his politics seem always to get in the way. It's more important than success to him. So you look at, and this is exactly, and Susan quoting all those letters about earning money and establishing himself as a writer in that way, and managing capitalistic artistic production, you know, all true. I mean, really smart about that, right? And yet, at the same time, he's constantly writing material without any concern about money. He's giving away lots of essays. He gave away a couple of novels to socialist publications. In particular, Gaylord Wilshire's magazine, Wilshire's magazine. And Wilshire is Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, Gaylord Wilshire. So, and he was a millionaire socialist, and he founded his own magazine. He was constantly asking Jack for socialist stuff, right? And Jack's like, okay, well, I'll give you this, but my going rate is, you know, 5 cents a word, 10 cents a word. And Gaylord's like, I can't pay you that. He's like, well, okay, you can have it for free. So yeah, were the majority of Americans socialists and socialist book buying public? No. So I guess the short answer to the question is, yeah, his politics did get in the way of success. He could have made even more money
That's what he said.
if he had.
My socialism has cost me thousands of dollars.
And yet he's still making, I mean,
Yeah, he was a millionaire socialist.
he was a millionaire
was.
socialist.
He
You know, he
was.
built that. I mean, I imagine everyone here has gone to Jack Lemmon State Park and seen the ruins of the Wolf House, right? I mean, could you afford
Not
to
yet,
build
not
it?
yet. You're going?
Hopefully, they get extra credit if they get.
Oh,
You
yeah.
gotta go.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. Could you build a, could I build a house like that? Are you kidding me? Not in a million years, you know. Not only was he making $1 million just from the sale of the book to George Brett at Macmillan, but then if you add in the amount of money that he earned from Cosmopolitan, the serial rights, it boosts up to another $500,000. And that's on top of the royalties that he's earning from the 40 other books that he's written. And that's on top of the movie rights that he's selling at this particular time, which I forgot to mention, that at this time, I mean, movies come up into this novel because Jack is now deep into the Hollywood scene.
The first full-length movie Hollywood made was Seawolf,
Yeah. And
a London book.
And he made money on that. And then John Barleycorn gets made into it. It was right around the same
And I think
time.
one, Charmian was able to keep his 1,400-acre ranch on Sonoma Mountain intact through the Depression by making deals with Hollywood producers to film his movies. I mean, make his stories in the movies.
Okay, so you could, to get back to your question, you could say that no, it didn't get in the way of his success because he knew he was making close to $2 million a year without charging Gaylord, Wilshire, and other socialist magazines for his stuff. So he could afford to give it away, right? And then he turned, I mean, Jack's a classic Irish poor mouth kind of guy, right? Don't you think? He's like, oh my God, and, you know,
He always
I could have
needed
made more money, you know, if I had only done this, this, and the other thing. If I had only bought Apple stock at 2 cents a share at the very beginning, you know, I'd be really rich. you
Only
know.
about 100,000 more eucalyptus trees.
Yeah.
Questions?
So my question is about ethnicities, like in the Bay Area. So when it came to like ethnicities, like African Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, did they live the same lifestyle after they got married, like the lower class or rich class white people?
minorities who were other minorities like Billy and Saxon,
Yeah.
they lived their
Yeah.
same lifestyle as they did
Yeah.
in the city, and like in that first part of the book?
Well, generally, like around California and that state.
I think he means not in the fictional story, but in
Right, right,
Reality.
Now,
No, that's a good question.
it is a good question. My gut reaction is that African Americans did not.
I'm thinking.
I don't know the sociology behind that. I don't know the history and the economics behind that. But just trying to
I'm
think,
thinking Asians would have been more likely to have a community to have, you know, because Billy and Saxon don't really have much of a community. A couple people they work with, but no family or relatives around. So, but I don't know if other groups, you know, I know in Boston it's still divided into, you know, different ethnic neighborhoods. And I'm not sure about the Bay Area.
Jews from different Eastern European countries that settled in the Bay Area did. And you can see mansions that those older families built from the turn of the century in San Francisco. And Valley of the Moon talks about, right, the Portuguese and the Dalmatians. We don't know about the Slavs, you know. We break them up according to countries, not so much according to a race called the Slavic race. But back then they would say, oh, people from the Czech Republic, Yugoslavian, or Albanians, you know.
You know, what we see in here,
That those people were making money out in the country, not in the city.
that's what Jack showed you, these different, like the Portuguese and these different kinds of people who figured out how to get out of the city and make money, which is what Saxon and Miller are trying to do. So he looks at the minorities who were like Saxon and Billy.
But then, like the history of the African American community in Oakland, you know, it's really fascinating stuff. And I've only kind of sampled it, and my sample is mostly, that community seems to have stayed working class. Though I think probably that changed with World War II because of all the defense work that people got, including blacks. So, interesting question, really fascinating stuff.
I have a question about why did Jack London drop out of Berkeley to join the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush, which was a good decision at the end because that's where he first published his first novel, you know. But why did he drop out to go to the Gold Rush?
Well, he dropped out before he knew about the gold rush. Didn't he?
But why did he drop out of college?
Okay, yeah. Well, there's some different stories about that. The most common one that you'll find if you read the biographies is for financial reasons. But isn't that when he worked in a laundry?
Mm-hmm.
He did get a job in a laundry at Belmont Academy.
So he enters Berkeley in
Fall of
96
and drops out in January of 1897.
And then he goes to work for the laundry that winter, and then that summer is when he goes to the Klondike.
Right, because, well, what I understand about the Klondike is there was the ship that came down in Umatilla. Was that in June?
Mm-hmm. June.
It came, and these guys walked off the gangplank with, you know, bags of gold dust. And the reporters were all over, and they said, yeah, you just dig it out of the ground. And when that boat turned around and went back up, you know, that was, the gold rush was on, and Jack was on that boat.
So it was like 6 months after he dropped out?
Yeah,
Yeah, at least.
yeah, it was, yeah.
No, that's right, 6 months out.
There's another story that, one of the reason he dropped out was he met somebody at Berkeley who told him that John London wasn't his biological father. And London was clueless, you know, he thought his mother and his father, and he had these two sisters, and they were a happy family. So he goes to the newspaper and looks in the files and finds this story that, you know, his mother had been living with this Irish astrologer. And when they were living together as husband and wife, although there's no marriage certificate, when he would have been conceived. And so Jack actually then tracks down Cheney and writes him a letter, says, could you be my father? And Cheney writes back and says, no, I was impotent at the time, which is the wrong word. But so Jack writes down and says, well, do you know who it could be? And he says, gee, I really don't know. You know, there was somebody from Ohio in the rooming house that Flora might have been seeing, but, you know, it was vague. And so some people who think that his illegitimacy influenced all of his writing go to that and say, you know, this really affected his whole life. But yeah, I think he had, until he was 21, he never had any clue that John London wasn't his father. He gave him his name, he raised him as his own son. It was, you know, disturbing maybe to find out, but I don't think it was traumatic really. So what he says, if you read Martin Eden, which is about his breaking into the writing career, he says, I realized that I could read the books that the professors were reading. I could read them faster and get a lot more out of them if I did it on my own than paying money and sitting in these classes. So that's what he says.
Yeah.
And he did. He relied on, you know, he was an avid reader. You know, when he was in school, we think of him as this great adventurer, you know, this boxer, and, you know, he was a bookworm. He says, I had a book in front of my face all the time. He was a bookworm. And he was,
To the day he died.
to the day he died, he was an avid reader. Every idea he got, you know, he'd read and research. And this is before computers.
Yeah. Compulsive reader, compulsive writer, compulsive drinker, compulsive gambler, compulsive farmer. In short, he was a compulsive person.
More questions?
But on the other hand, you'd think, okay, so he's just in college, right? But then, how many professors are characters in his novels? You know, it's just one after another. It's pretty remarkable in terms of all of American literature. There isn't really another American author who has that many professors. And in fact, 2 novels after Valley of the Moon, in a novel called The Star Rover, there's a professor of agronomy from Berkeley who kills his fellow professor and ends up in San Quentin on death row. That'll teach you.
Still goes on.
Right. Easy.
What was the name of the book?
The Star Rover.
It's a good one, you guys.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The thematic chain from Valley of the Moon to Star Rover to the last novel that he published, The Little Lady of the Big House, centers on 3 huge topics. It's like, these are the concerns of Jack London after he comes back from the Star trip to the Pacific. Food, prison, and, well, I mean, it's all seen through a socialist lens, right? And drinking. Those are the 3 big concerns for Jack, and they get played out in every single back from the Pacific. And it's like, it's one prison after another. You know, either the land is a prison, or drinking is a prison, or a ship called the Elsinore is a prison, or the prison. The Star Rover is about life in San Quentin. I mean, it's, you know, it's just unrelenting terror and torture in San Quentin. The prison is a prison, and then the final novel is called Little Lady of the Big House. And the phrase big house had just entered American slang for prison. It's bizarre to see that. It's just like, that suddenly occurred to me yesterday.
Okay, so back to politics. So Jack London, he said he was a socialist, right? And he wanted to be mayor of, I forgot the city.
He didn't want to
Oh,
be
down
mayor.
here, Oakland. He agreed to let him put his name up as a candidate.
And governor, he ran
And governor,
as a candidate for governor of California.
How would that have worked if he would have won?
he would not have accepted it.
He would not have-
No, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, how do you implement revolutionary socialism through traditional political, a traditional democratic political system? How can, when what you advocate is the overthrow of the political system, how would you do that as an elected official, right? So, I mean, his earliest letters to editors to the Oakland Tribune are like about single tax, are about cooperative ownership
municipal
of
water
yeah,
and stuff.
of water and electricity. I think that's where he would have started, right? You would have been like Cesar Chavez in Venezuela. First, the people own all the utilities. People own all, the worker has to own the means of production. The worker has to own the factories. And there were communities around America at this time where that was occurring. There was a factory town on the Mississippi River outside of St. Louis. And London knew about this place, interviewed the guy who ran that. So that may have been, and then you reach a certain point, some kind of unspecified point where everyone's like earning pretty much the same amount, because that's the goal. Everyone has to earn the same amount. Tax the rich, give it to the poor. I mean, that would be the plan, right? And then you reach a certain point where then it's like no more government, right? It just runs by itself, or people run it by itself. And the model is the artistic community in Cornell, right? That's where democracy truly lives. That's what he talks about in Valley of the North, right? Everyone's got their own thing going, everyone gets along. Of course, there aren't any immigrants there, everyone's white, but, you know,
I
that's,
think philosophically, though, the reason for redistributing the wealth is that if people are, if they're not homeless and they're not starving, you know, if they have a place to live and they have shelter and food and clothing and education for their kids, they don't have major worries that, so they can develop themselves, they can actualize their own potential. And that as long as, like you see in the beginning, how struggling and fighting for jobs like Bones drives Billy and Saxon, you know, out of their mind. And I think, you know, London never really has a plan for socialism. And it seems to me that really the ideal that America is the richest country in the world at the time, and, you know, we should be able to provide housing and education and shelter for all of our people. You know, if it weren't for greed in the capitalist system. So it's a vision, it's an ideal he has, but that really what he writes about is a critique of capitalism. When you look at what he's writing, he says, you know, the average working man's productivity has increased 1,000-fold. And then he says, you know, by doing this with the machine, you can produce 1,000 bales of hay in an hour, and, you know, man doing it, you could produce 40. And so we have this huge increase in the profit. He said, but where is it going? The working people are getting less wages. They're worse off than they used to be. How can this be? You know, it's always, I think, he can critique capitalism because he has this other vision. But to come out and say how the country's going to be run, I mean, or what that would look like is he doesn't go there.
yeah, when he's, the reference People of the Abyss from 1902 is sociological study of the London slums, again. He looks at it and he says, what's the solution? The solution is just to bulldoze the entire city. That's the solution. Because charity work doesn't work. Everything, all your liberal programs don't work. Capitalism obviously isn't
Reform
working.
doesn't work.
Reform doesn't work. So we have to bulldoze it, we have to destroy it all in order, and start over. Well, that's not a political program.
No. No, it's a philosophy or a vision.
So this is a question for, oh, someone have a question? No, go ahead, I already asked one.
My question was, so I know that a lot of other countries during the 1906 earthquake, they donated a lot of money to help rebuild San Francisco and like the surrounding area. My question was, if Jack London contributed to help rebuild?
Not that I know of. He went down and wrote the famous article and took photographs. That whenever there's an exhibit about the earthquake, usually it's his photographs and, you know, excerpts from his article about it. But I never heard that he...
Did he participate in any relief work? Did he house any people who were displaced by the earthquake?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. So the earthquake's April 1906, right? He leaves for the South Pacific in March 1907. The earthquake destroys pretty much his plans to build the boat and go sailing overseas, right? So that's his principal focus. It's like, you know, this has thrown a loop into my plans. How do I get back on my feet financially in order to build this boat, in order to go sail the Pacific, which is what? So, yeah, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, you kind of understand, well, he's got this huge concern. On the other hand, it's like, where were you?
Yeah, so, it's a question.
But then he didn't believe in charity, so it's like, you know, hey, you were living in San, you know, you're tough luck, you know. I got my own barn built.
Alright, so my question is, why did Jack London use naturalism a lot in his writing?
Say that again?
Naturalism, why did he use it a lot?
Use it a lot? Yeah. Yeah. Naturalism is a very tricky category, right? So he was aware of its foundations in French literature and Émile Zola, right? But he didn't really stick to a naturalist writing program either. He had his own ideas about what good writing was about. And then later, critics have sought to pigeonhole him as a naturalist writer, and they can do it because they find similarities and themes between London's work and Frank Norris, Stephen Crane. So you have a lot of violence, you have, I don't know, what other, you know, fate and deterministic.
Yeah, determinism, and the author generally doesn't intrude his viewpoint, just
Yeah, it's
stories
kind of
presented.
factual observation. But as many times as you find that in London's work, you also find, you know, strict romantic writing, and you find it in Valley of the Moon, right? So you have both at work. You have this awful scene that's so in your face about the guy trapped in the picket fence and getting beaten and turns his pistol and shoots what's his name to the side. I mean, it's just like bloody and awful. And on the other hand, you have like a little fawn and deer come down out of the woods, and you're like, oh, it's so cute, the babies and everything. So babies and fawns and deer and valley is so beautiful like that appear in Frank Norris? In the McTeague, everyone goes out in the desert, handcuffed, and then they all kill each other and die. You know, did Frank Norris ever? He wrote The Pit, you know, which is kind of like an abyss in a way, but. So that's how I would approach that question about London being a naturalist. It's like, in what ways was he not?
Yeah, I mean, he was into Darwin, and most of those naturalists had Darwinism in common. But they also tended to go into the unnatural, you know, like McTeague, you know, these criminal minds and things. And London doesn't really kind of go off to the abnormal a lot. He does have a story, I think it's the Indian chief who is at the end of his life and
Yes.
there's famine in the
Right.
land. And so they say, okay, did you read that?
Yes.
Okay. In there, then you know the scene where he says, it's like the story of life. He said it was told in the sap goes up the tree and the leaves come out and then they fall down. And so in naturalism, there's this negative and positive. And so what's positive is that the species goes on, even though on the individual level it's negative because we all in the end get sick and die. And so for the Indian chief to realize that by looking at nature in the tree, you know, the tree continues to live even though all the leaves fall off and die. So I think he knew exactly what it was all about, but he didn't want to conform or be limited to some little writing school or another.
I'm sad to have to cut you guys off with this, but